I'd be a liar if I said I was a big Harry Potter fan. I prefer spaceships and lightsabers to brooms and wands. But if there's one thing that has really bothered me about Harry Potter, it's the fourth film and the Triwizard Tournament. For a sports competition, it is incredibly unfair. And so we're going to look at fair testing and science and how the Triwizard Tournament negates all of that. Welcome to Science After Hours.
Putting aside the questionable behaviour of the author, the story of Harry and his time at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry has never particularly appealed. Conversations about the book series are met with indifference. I've seen each of the films once. But if you bring up The Goblet of Fire, that fourth book in the series, you had better be ready for a debate, because it annoys me at a scientific level. And as you've probably gathered from this lecture series, nothing could be worse than that. The point of this lecture is not to discuss the creation of the Triwizard Tournament or the Triwizard Cup or the machinations of Voldemort, its place in the Harry Potter canon. None of that is of interest to me. But before we get into the various trials the competitors face, we need to discuss what is considered a fair test in a scientific experiment, importantly in sport too. In order for a test to be considered fair, all of the variables must be kept constant except for the one thing that we are testing for, thus revealing the outcome of modifying that one single variable and nothing else. Take an example from my own work, a staple method in measuring bacterial internalization and their long-term survival within host cells, the gentamicin protection assay. In my experiment, we have a control cell line of normal cells and a mutant cell line where we have removed a gene from them. But importantly, they originate from the same cell population. These cells are then infected with the same type and the same amount of bacteria, and both cell populations are treated identically at all time points to negate the impact of any other variables. I utilize Salmonella typhimurium, for example, and we use the same strain to infect both cell populations, SL1344, because despite all being typhimurium, the different strains may express genes differently and may behave differently and therefore may impact the host cells differently. And so any differences we might observe, we can't be sure are down to the deletion in the host cells that we have made. They could be due to effects of the different strains of Salmonella. It's also important that we have a control for the mutation in our gene in the system, as using conventional wild-type cells, or a normal cell, is not suitable. We have used what is called a method of lentiviral infection. That is, we've got a lentivirus, a type of virus, to infect the host cells, and this brings with it the machinery to alter our gene of interest. Wild-type cells, straight out of the incubator, have not gone through this process, and so it would be unfair to compare these to our gene deletion mutant cells. So we need to infect these wild-type cells with a lentivirus, but we don't want to alter the genome, so we infect them with what is called a scrambled virus. It doesn't really have any effect on those normal cells. I say shouldn't really have any effect because occasionally, of course, it's science, things can happen. Thus, we have two cell populations that have been through the same processes, infected and treated in the same way, and therefore any of differences we observe between the two, we can assume are due to our deletion in the gene of interest that we have performed on that one population of host cells. Think about sports, for example. Football, again, not a big sports fan either, but both teams start with the same number of players. They both play for the same amount of time. They're both using the same football. It's not as if one team kicks one ball and another team kicks a ball that's made out of slightly different material, because that would obviously affect how the ball moves around the pitch. So that would be unfair. Or think about something like javelin, right? Everyone throws an identical javelin made of the same materials, it's made of the same length. They all have to throw it in roughly a similar way based on the rules that that sporting institution has implemented. So the results that we see are therefore due to the participant, the competitor in the sport. So let us think about the Triwizard Tournament. And through discussing Trial 1, we can already see issues of fairness, or should I say unfairness, creeping in. The aim of this first trial is to retrieve a golden egg that is being guarded by a dragon. The modifying variable in this, as in all sports, is the competitors, the 4 people representing the 3 schools. And thus, in order to be considered fair, all the other variables should remain the same, right? They should all go up against an identical dragon of the same species, raised in the same conditions and treated in identical fashion, like my Typhimurium example from earlier. But if you've seen the film, like me, or read the book and perhaps know considerably more, you know that this is not the case. There's 4 different dragons for the 4 different competitors. And these 4 dragons, unsurprisingly, have very different traits. Thus, even though the task is identical, retrieving the golden egg, all the dragons, I suppose, are considered dangerous. Because these dragons behave in different ways, it's most definitely an unfair test. Cedric Diggory comes up against the Swedish short snout that produces fire that is hotter than the average dragon, and this is highlighted by its blue colour, just like a Bunsen burner. And in the air, it's a more agile flyer, but on the ground, it's considerably less agile due to having, or not having, any front limbs. Fleur Delacour goes up against the common Welsh green, which from my research is considered to be one of the more docile species of dragon, preferring to avoid contact with humans completely and prey on smaller mammals like sheep. Ergo, one could most definitely argue that she is having a much easier time when compared with her fellow competitors. Next up is Victor Crumb, and he goes against this Chinese fireball species of dragon. Not only is this dragon type specifically described as aggressive, but when compared to other dragons, it fires its flame jet in a mushroom shape rather than a single jet, and thus that will require different methods to avoid it. And then of course we have Harry Potter himself, and he is placed against this Hungarian horntail. And all I have to say about this is that on the Harry Potter wiki, the description that goes with this dragon is said that it's considered to be the most dangerous breed of dragon, being faster and more aggressive than others. So here we have Harry up against what is considered the most aggressive breed of dragon, and then Fleur Delacour up against this dragon that is considered docile and avoids humans. That is absolutely not fair. And if I was Harry Potter, I would most certainly be quite furious that this is happening to me. To return to my earlier gentamicin protection assay example, this would be somewhat analogous to infecting the cell populations with 4 different types of bacteria, with some known to be more immunogenic than others, or having special capacity to survive within host cells. So E. coli, for example, is an extracellular bacteria pathogen that lacks any effector proteins that allow it to be able to survive intracellularly. Thus, if it invades a macrophage or it gets taken up by a macrophage, there's a high likelihood that this E. coli will be destroyed. Now imagine comparing that in the same experiment to something like Mycobacterium tuberculosis, an obligate intracellular bacterial pathogen, i.e. a bacterial pathogen that needs to be inside of a host cell to survive. So this Mycobacterium tuberculosis also has the capacity to induce necrosis, which is a form of cell death, which then results in a granuloma, which is more like a permanent damage to your lungs or wherever this granuloma may be occurring. If MTB is the Hungarian horntail, comparatively E. coli may as well be the Welsh green. Now I'll admit I struggle to think of a sport that might be somewhat analogous of this issue, as there aren't really any modern day events where we're pitted up against some sort of wild animal and tasked with surviving. But Gladiator 2 came out fairly recently, so that's almost identical to what is happening here. Imagine, you've got 4 gladiators and they all go up against 4 different animals. But these animals are something like one person goes up against a squirrel, and then you've got a badger, a lion, and perhaps a hippo. I would be pretty annoyed if I was being mauled to death by a lion or a hippo. Now, as I'm in my death throes, I look across the arena and there's someone just up against a squirrel. But that's enough about trial number 1. Let's complain about trial number 2, which tasks our 4 competitors from rescuing a person deep within a lake that's infested with these dangerous mer people. I'm going to ignore the fact that Harry does cheat in this task, in that he is supplied with gillyweed, this like magic plant that allows him to breathe underwater prior to the task even taking place, whereas the other 3 competitors have to rely on their magical prowess as the task is commencing and just focus on the mechanics, the raw mechanics of the task, rescuing these people from the lake. That being said, this task does seemingly involve kidnapping people and placing them at the bottom of a lake. Now, I'm not sure if permission is given for this, but someone that works in education, that is a big health and safety form that you'd have to fill out before placing these students and some normal people at the bottom of this lake. But anyway, the issue with this task comes down to a fundamental principle in physics, the Archimedes principle, which states that a body or a mass immersed in a fluid is subjected to an upwards force equal to the weight of the fluid displaced. Thus, the larger the object, the more fluid is displaced, and therefore the greater the buoyancy force, or the upward force that is exerted on it. Now, I imagine that most people have experienced the Archimedes principle if they've ever been swimming. You dive into the water and instead of just sinking straight to the bottom, you feel pushed back against the water and rise back up to the top. One must bear in mind that there are material aspects to the Archimedes principle. That's why some things float and some things sink. But we're going to try and keep this as simple as possible and ignore them. Now, you also may have seen it if you've ever tried to lift somebody in water. You realise it's much easier to lift them in water than it is on dry land. And what does this task involve? Lifting and carrying people underwater. In order for trial number 2 to be considered fair, each of the 4 competitors should dive down into the water and have to rescue an object of an identical size, weight, volume, and so the trial itself is their ability to adapt to this underwater environment and the dangers within. But of course not. These 4 contestants must carry 4 different people that each will be impacted by the Archimedes principle differently. For example, Gabrielle Delacour, Fleur's sister, is a very small child. Compare that to Ron Weasley, a teenager at this point. The water forces on them are going to be comparatively different. And that's ignoring the fact that they're obviously going to weigh differently, they're different sizes, the carrying strategies might be different. You could pick up a small child like this, but Ron, you might need a over-the-shoulder sort of technique, and that's going to impact how you swim. Again, I couldn't think of a real analogous sport example. Perhaps I should watch some more sports, but I remember we used to have a swimming pool at our school, and we'd have like sports days centered just around swimming. And so one of the tasks would be sort of to dive into the water and rescue like a beanbag at the bottom of the pool. Now imagine that one person has to pick up a weight that is 10 meters by 10 meters, and the other one has to pick up one that is just like the size of a golf ball. That is considerably unfair, and the same principle relies here. Ultimately, the 3rd trial is a maze, so it's not really that unfair, and I don't really have anything to complain about there. But these first 2, I wouldn't recommend taking part in the Triwizard Tournament if it comes to a magic school near you. Thank you for watching.